The belief was that enslaved people could only do agricultural work. But there was this small revolution beginning just before the Civil War in terms of using slaves much more broadly in industrial settings. And of course, it worked extraordinarily well, in gruesome but highly profitable ways. And one of the key differences between that industrial slavery before the Civil War and the agricultural slavery was that slaves used in an industrial setting are viewed very differently than they are in an agricultural setting, because the image that you have, that most people have, of antebellum slavery, of slave families living out, no matter how benign or malevolent you view slavery, wherever you are on the scale of how bad it was. Everybody here, I'm sure, accepts among the more extreme malevolence versions of them, but some people still astonishingly hold on to some idea of slavery as this more benign thing in terms of the treatment of African Americans. But even in the most malevolent view that we have of agriculture and antebellum slavery, there was some kind of familiarity between slaves and their owners. And because part of the business of slavery was the raising of slaves, was encouraging the procreation of slaves because they were assets to these business enterprises, because of that, there was some encouragement, even among the destruction of families, there was some encouragement of family life among slaves in the antebellum South. There also was an appreciation of the economic reality that a white farmer wanted slaves to live a fairly long period of time so that they could reproduce, so that they could work for a long time. And the investment to acquire slaves was very, very high. By far, oftentimes a slave owner invested far more in slaves than he did in land. And so there was an economic incentive to maintain the lives of slaves, even as terrible as it was. But in industrial slavery was a completely different calculation. And in industrial slavery, the idea was there was no need for women except for to perform a few functions of the traditional women's functions at that time. And so the idea in a slave-operated sawmill or coal mine, the only kinds of slaves that a commercial operator had any interest in were young men from the age of 16 to 30, but young, strong men who could then, who if employed effectively in these industrial settings, could be so profitable that the return on that investment could occur so quickly. 4 or 5 years, there were actually some farms that employed a version of this kind of industrial agriculture in the Mississippi Delta, where in the early settlement of the part of Mississippi where I come from. There was an agricultural version of this where the farms were so lucrative in the 1840s and 1850s that if a slave survived only 2 or 3 seasons, that was sufficient to pay back the cost of the slave and a reasonable profit on that investment. And so this industrialized kind of slavery was far more contemptuous of the lives and the health of those enslaved people. This new kind of slavery that's resurrected after the Civil War takes on all of the character of the most terrible types of industrial slavery that had preceded the Civil War. Into involuntary servitude through the judicial system is next to nothing. So whereas before the Civil War, a strong 20-year-old African-American man might well cost a farmer $1,000, after the Civil War in the 1870s and the 1880s, it becomes possible to go down to the courthouse of almost any county in the Deep South, in those counties where there's a large black population, at almost any time, and purchase out of the county jail a black man for $50 or $75, or on a promise to pay the sheriff $10 a month for 1 year or for 2 years. And so the cost of acquiring this labor and acquiring these individuals is incredibly low. And so even more so, there's no incentive whatsoever to ensure the survival of these individuals. And so they were starved, they went unclothed, they never had adequate food or health care, they lived in execrable conditions, and the accounts of all this that survive are endless. And in these labor camps that popped up all over the Deep South, but particularly in Alabama, Georgia, northern Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and parts of Mississippi. And in these places, thousands and thousands and thousands of African American men were held against their will on these trumped up charges, and huge numbers of them died. And of course, they were subject to the lash and punished in terrible ways. Waterboarding, it wasn't called waterboarding, but the water cure was one of the most common kinds of tortures used to punish punish the men in these camps. And so all of that was happening within the legal system. But there was a side effect of that this, in this society, which just a few years before had been completely oriented to forced labor, and in which the business of acquiring, buying, and selling and managing slaves had been one of the biggest industries, not just in the South, but in the United States. The business practices and business sensibilities of the business of slavery resurrected themselves. There were lots of people still around who had grown up in a world in which slavery was a good business. And so once the judicial system recreated these avenues of enslavement and began to establish a market value on impoverished, illiterate, but strong African American men, then outside the legal system, these forces were unleashed. And so the business of slavery began to resurrect itself. And soon you had huge numbers of African American men being kidnapped off the back roads of the South and effectively sold into slavery, either under some chimera of a legal charge, or just an arrogant recognition that no one's going to do anything about this, and so we can do it. And so you ended up with big plantations in the Deep South, where you had big, huge plantations where there would be hundreds of these forced laborers, and a large number of them would have come from the actual judicial process, a few of whom had probably actually committed a crime, the majority of whom had done nothing except been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then probably an equal number of African American men who were being held there as if they were convicts, as if they had committed crimes, but in fact had not. And this system metastasized in the 1890s, in the very beginning of the 20th century, because of a variety of reasons. One of the biggest of which was that across the entire United States, by 1900, first years of the 20th century, there essentially is no meaningful constituency among whites anywhere in the country for the preservation of civil rights or legal rights for African Americans. White Americans on the whole, by the beginning of the 20th century, have effectively given up on the idea of citizenship for blacks, for the freed slaves or their descendants. There are, and most of our history focuses on those brave voices that continue to work for the rights and citizenship of African Americans. But on the whole, in every part of the country, there's no meaningful constituency anymore. There's no political constituency for the defense of African Americans. The Republican Party, which in the first 40 years after the Civil War had valiantly, in certain respects, valiantly defended the victory of the Civil War, gives up on the whole notion of citizenship for blacks, of actual citizenship. Teddy Roosevelt starts off as a guy who was in 1901, starts off as a president who wants to see a square deal for the Negro and real rights and citizenship for blacks, but by the end of his presidency he's given up on it. And then he's succeeded